Hey guys, it's Mrs. KP. Unfortunately, it looks like we're not going to be together for a while. I miss you guys a lot, and I figured we could read the final 2 chapters of The Littles and the Big Storm before you completely forget about the story. So in the Google Classroom, I have uploaded the last 2 chapters so you can follow along with me as I read. You can read it on your own, or you can just listen along as I read. So for those who don't remember, in chapter 9, the basement had fully flooded, the sump pump wasn't working, and Mr. Little and Grandpa Little wanted to create a raft to go explore what's happening with the sump pump so they could potentially fix it. Lucy came up with a great idea to create a raft out of Lincoln logs and rubber bands. So some of you were able to make some rafts out of Lincoln logs and rubber bands, and they floated. You guys did great. So, yeah, that's where we ended with chapter 9. So let's get into the last 2 chapters. Chapter 10. All of the Littles set to work on the raft project. Grandpa was in charge. He pointed out which Lincoln logs and planks were needed. Tom and Lucy went looking for rubber bands. The rest of the tiny people carried logs and planks from Henry Bigg's closet to the cellar. They piled them on the bottom step. Baby Betsy was awake, so Mrs. Little had to carry her in a sling on her back. The baby seemed to enjoy the bouncing around. When everything was finally in place, the raft was put together. At each point where a log rested across another log, they were held together with a rubber band. After a square of logs was put together, the planks were set on top of them like a floor. Large rubber bands were used to hold the planked floor in place. While this was going on, Mrs. Little went to the Biggs' kitchen. She found some plastic spoons to use as paddles. This is Oliver, for those who don't know him. At last, the raft was in the water. By this time, the water was high enough to cover the bottom step. "All aboard," said Lucy. "Not so fast, Lucy," said Mr. Little. "There's not enough room for everyone aboard this raft." "I never intended to go," said Mrs. Little. "Betsy and I will wait here."
Maybe Tootsies.
3 people on the raft are enough," said Mr. Little.
Maybe Tootsies.
Ollie, gotta be quiet, okay? Because we gotta listen. 3 people on the raft are enough," said Mr. Little.
Tootsies.
"Grandpa, Uncle Pete, and I will go." The cellar lights blinked off and on. The thunder rumbled outside. Tom was disappointed about not going on the raft, but he didn't make a fuss.
Oh.
Lucy was angry, though. "That's not fair," she said with tears in her eyes. "It was my idea to use Lincoln logs. I should be allowed to go." "Lucy, we don't have time for your temper tantrum," said Mr. Little. He hopped aboard the raft. Grandpa sat down in the middle of the raft. Mr. Little and Uncle Pete paddled with the plastic spoons. The raft moved slowly out into the flooded cellar.
The end.
No, not quite. It headed for the other side of the room. "I hope they don't take any chances," said Mrs. Little. "It's just not all that important. We have to do our best to take care of the house when the Biggs are away," said Granny Little. "Oh, I suppose you're right," said Mrs. Little. There the Littles are on their rafts that look very similar to the ones you guys built. "If only we had some scuba diving gear," Tom said. "Dad would be able to get down to the sump pump easily." Lucy was still angry over being left behind. She stood apart from the others. As she looked around the cellar, she saw the many pipes near the ceiling and on the walls. They crisscrossed all over the cellar. One of them was a fat, hot air pipe connected to the furnace. It came very close to the top of the cellar stairs. Suddenly, Lucy knew just how she could see what the men on the raft were doing. Slowly, the tiny girl backed away from the others. She quickly climbed to the top of the stairs. Now, the hot air pipe was only an inch away. Lucy jumped from the stairs to the pipe. She made her way along the pipe towards the furnace in the center of the cellar. The pipe was large enough so that a tiny person could walk on it easily. When the pipe got near the furnace, it slanted down from the ceiling. Lucy slid down the pipe. At this point, Lucy was standing on the pipe where it entered the furnace. She was about 5 feet above the flooded cellar floor. Lucy could see everything. Below and ahead of her was the raft. At the far wall of the cellar, Lucy could see the electric fuse box. There's Lucy on top of the pipe.
Oh, yeah.
It was near a black plastic pipe coming out of the water. That was where the pump was. Lucy knew that. Behind her, at the bottom of the cellar stairs, Lucy saw the rest of the Littles. Good, they hadn't even missed her. But what was that moving at the top of the stairs? Lucy tried hard to see. Just then the lightning flashed. The thunder exploded right afterward. It sounded like a bomb going off. At the same time, the lights went out. Lucy jumped at the sound. She lost her balance in the dark. Her foot slipped. She reached out to catch herself, but there was nothing to get hold of. "Daddy!" screamed Lucy as she fell from the pipe. So Lucy just took a tumble, and also she saw something at the top of the stairs. We keep having these strange mysteries where the Littles are seeing little things out of the corners of their eyes and things are going missing. So let's see if we can solve those mysteries in our last chapter, chapter 11. Careful. Mr. Little stood on the raft, trying to see into the blackness. "Wasn't that Lucy yelling?" he said. "It sounded as if it came from above us." "How could that be?" asked Uncle Pete. "We left her back on the cellar stairs." Will! It was Mrs. Little calling across the water. "Lucy isn't here. She's disappeared." "Great Scott!" said Uncle Pete. "It was Lucy. What on earth was she screaming for?" "Lucy, Lucy!" called Mr. Little. "Where are you?" No answer. Mr. Little shouted over to the others. "Stay where you are. It's too dark to move around." Then he said to the men on the raft, "We should have brought some candles. Why didn't we think of that?" "Let's pray for the lights to come back on," said Grandpa. "I can't see a thing," said Mr. Little. "I've never felt so helpless in my life." "Will, she's here!" It was Mrs. Little again. "She's here!" "Thank heavens," said Mr. Little. "Get Grandpa over here, Will," called Mrs. Little. "There's a surprise here for Grandpa." "What did she say?" asked Grandpa. "Says there's a surprise for you," Uncle Pete said. "Keep yelling," said Mr. Little to Mrs. Little. "We'll paddle toward your voices." By now, the men on the raft were beginning to see dimly in the dark cellar. The people on the cellar steps kept up a steady yelling to guide them. Mr. Little laughed. "That's an awful racket," he said. "I hear a man's voice over there, don't I?" asked Grandpa. "Impossible," said Uncle Pete. "There's no man there." When they were almost to the steps, the lights came back on. "Hooray!" yelled everyone. Mr. Little blinked from the bright light. He looked toward the cellar stairs. There were 3 other tiny people standing there with his family. One was a tall man wearing overalls too large for him. There were 2 children standing next to the man. They were dressed in green. One was wearing a green hat with a blue feather. The other child had on the same kind of hat, but no feather. Remember the blue feather we found in the kitchen? There's the family with some new tiny people. "Oh my goodness, this is too good to be true," said Grandpa. "Look who's here. My good friends, the Brook Tinies, have come to visit." Grandpa jumped off the raft. He hugged the children. Then he said to the man, "Mr. Beck, how'd you know I was dying to see Pearl and Dewey?" "Because they were dying to see you," said the children's father. "Ever since coming home from being shipwrecked, they've talked my ear off about visiting you." Dewey Beck, who seemed about 10 years old, said, "We've been wandering around this big house for a couple of days looking for you." "And they found us just in time," said Mrs. Little, "just when Lucy fell from the furnace into the water." "Thank heaven," said Granny Little. Pearl Beck, about 12 years old, pointed to the top of the stairs. "We were up there," she said, "when we saw Lucy on the hot air pipe. When the lights went out, she screamed. We heard the splash. Dad dived in and pulled her out." "In the dark," said Tom. "I didn't know who was helping me," Lucy said, "and I didn't even care." Pearl said, "House tinies live in strange places. It's nothing like a cave, and it's not like the tree stump house. Did you know there's a huge cat in this house? It chased us." "That's Hildy, our friend," said Tom. "Hey, were you behind the refrigerator in the kitchen hiding from the cat? Did you lose a feather?" "Refrigerator," said Dewey. "What's that? Where's the feather?" He felt his hat for the missing feather. The Littles laughed. "I think we were in the kitchen when that fierce animal growled at us," said Mr. Beck. "Weren't we, children?" "Yes," Pearl said. "We ran like chipmunks." Uncle Pete roared with laughter. "Then it was you I saw running away when I turned on the garbage disposal," he said. "Garbage disposal," Mr. Beck said. He scratched his head. "We sure have a lot to learn about house living." Granny Little was looking closely at Mr. Beck. "Where'd you get those overalls, Mr. Beck?" she asked. "These?" said Mr. Beck, looking down at his dripping overalls. "They don't fit very well, do they? I found them at the top room in the house the other day when we were searching for you. I put them on because I'd ripped my clothes badly on a nail in the wall," he laughed. "You know, when you get a brook tiny away from the water, he can be clumsy." "Oh, that reminds me of the part of the mystery," said Tom. "Were you swimming in the bathroom sink?" "We did find a nice place to swim," said Mr. Beck. "I guess it was the bathroom. I hope we didn't do anything wrong." "We would have emptied the water when we were through," said Tom. "So the Biggs wouldn't know," added Lucy. "Ah, you see, we do have a lot to learn," said Mr. Beck. "Anyway," Mr. Little said, "the mystery is solved, and we're thankful for your help in saving Lucy." "And we need some more of your help," said Grandpa. He pointed across the flooded cellar and explained the problem. "What can we do?" asked Mr. Beck. "Just before the lights went out, I saw what was wrong," Grandpa went on. "How could you?" asked Mr. Little. "The pump is underwater." "It wasn't hard to figure out," said Grandpa. "The cord wasn't plugged in." "Oh my goodness," said Mr. Little. "Mr. Beck and the children are excellent swimmers," Grandpa went on. "They can dive down under the water and find the plug for us. We'll dry it off and get it up to the outlet by the fuse box where it belongs." "Very good," said Mr. Little. "It would be wonderful if we could get the cellar dry again before the Biggs get back." "Do you really want to dry this up?" asked Mr. Beck. "What a shame. This place is beautiful just the way it is." The Littles laughed. "Spoken like a true brook, Tiny," said Grandpa. By the next day, the storm was over. The Littles and the Becks spent the morning visiting with each other. That afternoon, Cousin Dinky, Della, and Uncle Nick came back from Trash City. Uncle Nick made a sour face. "We just had 3 very boring days," he said. "The mice disappeared when the storm came." "The storm was no problem at the dump either," Della said. "That city is so well made," said Cousin Dinky, "that the water runs off as easily as it does off a duck's back." "You should have stayed home," said Grandpa. He winked at Tom and Lucy. "Yeah," said Tom. "We had a mystery." "And a flood," said Uncle Pete. And lots of exciting things happened," said Lucy. "It was a blessing," said Granny Little. She smiled at her husband. 2 days later, the Big family came home. Mr. Big looked quickly through the house. "It's amazing," he said to his wife. "There are no problems from the storm. You know, when I first saw that tree knocked down in the yard, I thought, but everything inside is all right. Not a broken window or a leak anywhere. And the cellar is as dry as a bone." The end. So the mystery is solved. It was Grandpa Little's friends, the Brook Tinies, who came for a visit. And they were able to dry out the cellar. And the Biggs still have no idea that the Littles exist in their walls. Hope you guys liked these final 2 chapters. I miss you all, and we will be in touch. See ya.